Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Is their love carried over from their student days, all in vain? Today's story has a similar plot. Enjoy watching. The biggest surprise was how calm I felt after the myriad of emotions that had washed over me over the past 24 hours. The icy calm was soothing to the point of hypnosis. My thoughts were interrupted. "Hey buddy, want another beer?" The bartender here was not exceptionally attentive. I had been sitting on this very stool for the last hour and a half and was still drinking my first drink. The bar didn't make much money for me today. "Not now, thanks, maybe a little later," I replied casually, continuing to watch the reflection in the mirror of the couple in the back booth of this smoky establishment. The smell of cigarette smoke was a little strange. Obviously, the Midwest had not yet been caught up in the health craze that was sweeping the West Coast states. The place was old with a warm, homely feel, with a lingering smell of smoke, old wood, and stale booze. I think the best way to describe it would be as a neighborhood tavern, a long counter with high stools facing an antique bar covered with a mirror along its entire length and many bottles of booze, at least 8 or 9 different brands for every type of alcohol imaginable. The visual delight of an alcoholic. Along the wall opposite the bar were deep booths stretching from the front to the very back where you could sit if you didn't want to, so to speak, put your stomach on the counter. The bartender stopped in front of me for a moment as if he was about to say something. Taking the hint, I continued our tense conversation. "I don't need any more drinks right now, but you can pass me that basket of popcorn," I said, and tipped him another $5 for his troubles. It was very important that he did not bother me about my drinking habits and did not offer me supplements. I had the only chair that allowed me to clearly see in the mirror the couple now occupying the last booth. This last booth was hard to see from anywhere else in the room, and I wasn't about to give up mine. All I knew about the male half of the couple was that his name was Will Hart. He was a year younger than me and graduated from Roosevelt High School in 1985. I also knew that he was smooth-talking and had a good eye for the ladies. The only thing I knew that he didn't was that his immediate future was about to turn into absolute darkness. Even though the lady sitting in the booth with him was his age, she was still attractive enough to make passing men between 15 and 65 give her a second and third glance. At 5 feet 5 inches and weighing 57 kilograms, she had a better-than-average figure which hinted that at 20 years old she was striking. Her figure now had that slight fullness that gave mature ladies that rounded set of curves that made men want to fall face down between the inviting soft cushions of flesh and kiss their way to a place where they could breathe. She wasn't what you'd call beautiful, but she was damn cute. Dark hair, blue eyes, a small birthmark on the inside of his left thigh. I knew a lot about her. After all, we had been married for 15 years. She was supposed to be with her friends at the 20-year high school reunion. I was supposed to be 1,500 miles away at home. Looks like we both didn't do what we should have done when it came to homecoming. For the first time, I agreed to go with her, and she just ran around making plans for a triumphant return to the old stomping ground. It's not that we didn't go back there from time to time, but since her father died and her mother moved in with us closer to family, she hasn't had a chance to come back here. Consequently, she had not seen her old friends for 6 or 7 years. The problem arose when I had to tell her that the company I was working for had merged with our main competitor and the merger would not be completed by the time the reunion happened. This, in turn, meant that I would not go to the meeting with her. She became furious, and when she finally calmed down, she became, how can I put it better, coolly neutral. Our life and everything else of a personal nature definitely took a back seat over the next 10 days. She spent most of her time on the phone with her old friends planning what they would do, what they would wear, who would come, and who wouldn't. But what seemed strange was that when the name Will was mentioned, she spoke in a much quieter voice and went into another room to end the conversation. One evening, I answered the phone, and a man asked for Lynn. When I asked who was calling, he said his name was Will and that he was a former classmate who would be at the high school reunion and that he just wanted to talk to her. When I covered the phone with my hand and said the name Will, she grabbed the phone and ran out of the room. A rather lengthy conversation followed, at the end of which Lynn began to speak very quietly. When I asked who Will was, she became defensive and refused to talk about him at all. We quarreled and remained in this state until she left for this meeting. I am not the gentlest of people by nature, so by the time Lynn left for her homecoming, I was in a very bad mood and began to have all sorts of suspicions. The first evening after she left, I noticed that she had forgotten to take her yearbook, which she had been using for the last month for reference, remembering, and trying to remind who was who. I scrolled through until I found old Will. He was a cute boy with dark curly hair. Above and below his photo was the inscription, "Lynn, to the cutest and funniest girl in the senior class. Remember the last FFA hay wagon ride? You still owe me a prize. I wish you good luck at university. Let's see if we can't find another haystack when you come home for Christmas. Always remember that you were delighted with Will." Lord, were we all really so benign at that age? What the hell does this all mean? Should there be a prize? What's the prize? What was Lynn's history with this idiot? As I flipped through the rest of the yearbook, I felt my fears and anger creep up, even though I had no particular reason for it other than the insinuating note on Will's photo. However, my alpha male continued to grow. Further research revealed that he was a very popular guy, an above-average student, and a linebacker on the university football team. All I could think to myself was, this guy? I was a linebacker in high school and college, and I would kick as I ever met him. Apparently, continuing to read about Will didn't improve my mood at all. During this time, my mood did not improve, and my work, the merger of two companies into one, was much easier to do on paper than in the real world. Here and now, each had their own way of doing everything, from timekeeping to order processing, and each side was more than reluctant to give up what was familiar and comfortable to it. My job was to make sure that we became one integrated company, doing business as one company while continuing to conduct business as usual at all times. When we began this process, my boss gave me only one cryptic instruction: make this merger seamless and invisible to our customers. Easy to say, hard to do. So, reluctant employees had to be encouraged and persuaded that 13 and 14-hour days were the norm. By the end of the day, I was as upset and angry as can be. What added fuel to the fire was that I called Lynn every evening after she left, and the only time I managed to catch her was at her girlfriend's house, where she was staying. She was very abrupt and evasive when I tried to make small talk about how things were going and how she was feeling. The other 2 evenings, she was out with her friends, according to the babysitter who looked after her friends' children. Asking her to call me when she returned yielded 0 results. On the 4th night after she left, at 11 p.m., just after I had gotten out of the shower and sipped a cold beer, my only source of pleasure for several days, I received a call. When the call rang, I decided that it was Lynn who was finally calling back in response to my calls. And when I picked up the phone, I immediately said, "Hey baby, how are you?" The startled male voice on the other end of the line hesitated for a moment before answering, "Excuse me, is this Jim Thornton?" Confused, I managed to answer rather stupidly, "Sorry, yes, I can help you." "Jim, this is Bob Sims from Riverdale. I'm Maggie Sims's husband. We met several years ago when you and Lynn were visiting us." "Oh yeah, Bob, sorry, I didn't recognize you. How are you? I hope that Lynn staying with you does not cause too much inconvenience to you and your wife." Something happened, I added, suddenly realizing that Bob would not just call at this late hour. Not really. This call is something like a conversation between two husbands. I wouldn't want to pry into your and Lynn's personal affairs, but I think you should reconsider and come to Riverdale. Bob's words sent a chill down my spine, and a knot formed in my stomach. Why? Is something wrong? Not so much at the moment, but I think there is potentially a problem. Do you know the guy that Lynn and Maggie went to school with named Will Hart? Our conversation didn't last long, but at the end, I thanked Bob for his concern and for calling. Less than 30 minutes later, I ordered a ticket to Riverdale via the computer and packed my suitcase. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get there until 7:30 tomorrow night, but hey, sometimes the cover of darkness is a big advantage. Having finished all the preparations that could be done in the middle of the night, I went to bed and tried to sleep. My imagination was spinning wildly in my head. Was Lynn really starting the romance that was interrupted 20 years ago? Am I jealous for not trusting her anymore? I was in love with Lynn from the very first time we met, and by the second date, I knew that she was the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. From then on, she became the center of my universe, even if I didn't always show it. She has always been loving and caring, and I was just as crazy about her today as I was at the beginning. I always thought that she felt the same way, and I didn't even consider that she could feel differently. Granted, over the past few years, I've gone into career growth mode, and our personal relationships, including nights out on the town and just general time on Saturday afternoons, have been pushed to the back burner on autopilot. I accepted this as the norm for our time and place in life. Maybe she decided it wasn't for her and opted for something more exciting than parent-teacher conferences, soccer games, and the occasional movie when I wasn't too tired after work. At first, I felt physically sick at the thought that she might be having an affair. Then I got angry that she didn't appreciate the efforts I made to get everything we wanted and planned. When I thought about the fact that she could be with another man, my anger went through the roof. I always had some kind of possessive streak, but nothing significant ever came of it. Now, it has blossomed in full force. Finally, my anger calmed down to a simmering flame dancing just below the surface of my consciousness, but it still kept me from sleeping peacefully at night. When I don't sleep well at night, it's bad. I get very grumpy, and when I get grumpy, I'm not very pleasant to deal with. The only good thing was that Lynn's mom came over to watch the kids while she was gone. So early in the morning, I would just leave as if I was going to work. If Lynn calls, she won't know that I went to Riverdale. I'll leave my mother-in-law a note that I have to work a 24-hour shift, and I'll call her later to make sure she and the kids are okay. The next morning, I went to work and told my very unhappy boss that I would be gone for a few days and that if necessary, he could fill in for me, and I would come back and do another job. He wasn't happy, but he didn't fire me either, so I guess it was a small victory that I desperately needed. As I mentally began to oscillate between heartbreaking depression and absolute murderous rage, airplane flying is mostly deathly boring, but it has its advantages. They provide a strictly measured period of time and relative isolation to think things through without interruption, allowing time and peace to formulate plans, and, most importantly, gain control over yourself. By the time I landed in Riverdale, I had already developed a concrete plan of action, which, in turn, brought a calm that I thought impossible just that morning. After we landed, I rented a car and called Bob. He said that they all got together, including my wife and Will, at a place called Clancy's, where they danced and drank. Having found the designated location, I quickly changed in the parking lot into nondescript jeans, a plaid shirt, and a baseball cap, and then quietly made my way into Clancy's lounge. Looking in the mirror as I walked in, I barely recognized myself and felt that Lynn would have to physically bump into me if she got close enough to recognize me. In all the years we were married, she only saw me in a plaid shirt a couple of times, and she certainly never saw me in a baseball cap. I never wore caps or hats because someone once told me when I was young that they caused baldness, and I developed a real aversion to wearing anything on my head. I never liked wearing a football helmet, but I forced myself to wear one when I played football, both in high school and at the small state college where I met Lynn. The fact that I was blonde further enhanced the illusion that I was losing my hair. Business was doing fairly well when I first walked in, as apparently, Riverdale had been hosting a homecoming party for a few years now, and the place was about 60% filled with a range of people ranging in age from about 25 to a little older than 60. I learned from the bartender that Clancy's is a very old establishment and is frequented mostly by locals or, in this case, those who once lived here and have returned for one reason or another for a few weeks each summer. Homecomings were pretty good business, and this summer was no exception. There was an old-fashioned jukebox inside, and at the back of the building, there was a small dance floor where different generations differed not only in appearance but also in the tunes they danced to. When I first saw my wife and Will, they were sitting in a back booth with two other couples, all in the same booth, one couple on each side. The only difference being Lynn and Will sitting opposite each other. In the first hour of my stay there, the six of them drank, danced, and generally just talked, as befits old friends who have not seen each other for a long time. In one of the couples, I recognized Bob and Maggie, the ones with whom Lynn lived, but I did not know the others. Bob looked around the room from time to time as if he was expecting someone, but even when he looked straight at me, there was no hint of recognition. It was probably a good thing because I didn't want Lynn to know I was here right now, and I don't know how good an actor Bob would be if he noticed me around. The crowd began to thin out, and I sat down at my favorite place at the bar with my back to the booth in which they were sitting. At this time, both couples stood up, apparently saying goodbye. Bob told Lynn something like she needed a ride home, but he and Will made it clear that he would take her home later since they were going to be staying a while longer. So, I was still drinking my first beer and eating my third or fourth bowl of popcorn since I arrived. At first, they sat across the table from each other, sipping drinks and talking. As time passed, it was clear from gestures and body language that the conversation was becoming more serious. Will reached across the table and quietly stroked the back of Lynn's hand and forearm with one finger while he made some important remarks, to which she nodded her head from time to time or responded with a quiet single word. Damn, I wish I could hear what they're talking about. I didn't know exactly what the words were, but I'd seen enough to recognize it trying to lure her prey into a trap scenario. The flames of my anger burned brighter, but nothing happened yet, and I was content to be patient and watch events unfold. If things hadn't gone any further than that, I would have called Lynn on her cell phone later that evening and told her that we had finished the project and that I would be in Riverdale tomorrow to stay with her for the rest of the homecoming events. That way, I would demonstrate that I wanted to be with her without her knowing that I was spying and getting angry again. In this situation, I began to relax and felt better. It seemed like she wasn't going to forget that she had a husband and 2 kids at home, and I wouldn't have to kick old Wills. My optimism was dashed when suddenly he stood up, walked over to the bar next to me, and ordered another round of drinks for the 2 of them from the bartender, Mike. I noticed he was drinking beer, but Lynn was drinking gin and tonic, a bad sign since at home it was her favorite cocktail when we went out and planned an bout of active when we got home. While Will stood next to me, I crouched low in case Lynn was looking in our direction. Now was a lousy moment to be discovered. He looked at me casually and remarked, "Are you from here?" "No, I'm from the West Coast, just solving a family problem." "Are you from here?" "Not anymore. I graduated from high school and returned here only for the 20-year reunion, for the first time since I left school." "Are you having fun?" "Not really yet, but I have a feeling things will change soon," he replied with a determined grin. Around this time, Mike brought their drinks, and he returned to the booth. But instead of sitting in his original seat, he slid into the booth next to Lynn. Between his comment and this new arrangement of them, my mood became even darker. Raising my head, I shouted to the bartender, "Hey, Mike, give me another stout." He grinned as if he had won some kind of prize, saying, "Sure," then walked over and placed the beer in front of me. This time, I slipped him $10. I would soon need Mike on my side, and he, like all employees in such establishments, had his eye on the money. Meanwhile, they led Lynn to the jukebox and fumbled for quarters while she chose a song. Standing there, they held hands like high school students, holding each other firmly. They danced to a few fast musical numbers, then a slow romantic tune started playing, and they hugged and swayed slowly in the far corner of the dance floor. Soon, Lynn had her arms around Will's neck, and he grabbed her with both hands. By the end of the song, he had gone so far as to cup her buttocks with both hands. Another slow tune began, and she seemed to try to push him away a couple of times, but he was persistent, and after a few minutes, she gave up any protest. They whispered occasionally but were mostly silent, Lynn pressing her face against his chest and him burying his face in her hair as they danced slowly across the floor. During all this time, people gradually left Clancy until there were only a half dozen or so left scattered throughout the establishment. I motioned to Mike and handed him a folded $50 bill so he could get a good look at it, then leaned closer to him across the counter. "Do you have a security camera around here somewhere?" He looked down at Grant's face on the bill for a second, then quickly looked over his shoulder and replied, "Yes, there are half a dozen hidden in the ceiling niches and one in each parking lot." I handed over the bill. "I want camera footage covering this part of the room from 2 hours ago until I left, whenever that may be. Also, I want to get the footage from the camera in the back parking lot, okay?" I stated as coldly as I could, looking straight into Mike's face without batting an eyelid. "I don't know, man, something like this could get me into some really deep," he replied nervously. "Why do you need these notes? What are you going to do?" Ignoring his question, I continued to look at his face. "If you do this, you'll get 4 more grands." And then he just sat there and waited for the dollar signs to come in. After 30 seconds of feigned disinterest, he replied, "Okay, but if something happens, I'll turn around and cover my." "No problem, Mike. You're as safe. Just please me a little." I then ended our conversation by standing up and looking around for Lynn and the others. As I was thinking about Will, I was not prepared for what I saw, and I had to suppress a scream so as not to disrupt everything. There, in a dark corner of the dance floor, they were locked in a kiss that was a full-blown exchange of saliva and tongues. I was about to intervene when Lynn pushed the guy off abruptly, returned to their booth, and sat down. She seemed stunned when Will slid in next to her and wrapped his arms around her, whispering something that seemed to calm her down. She leaned against him with her eyes closed as they quietly sipped their drinks. They sat there for a while until he turned her to face him and pulled her towards him for another searing kiss. She tried to resist again, but eventually gave in and returned the hug with equal passion. It took all my willpower not to drag her out of the booth, kick her and then kick this right in the middle of the hall. In front of me was the woman I loved more than my own life, the mother of my children, behaving like some kind of hormonally hypertrophied high school student. The surprise intensified, and while I was watching the reflections in the mirrors, his hand appeared on her chest and began to slowly stroke first one, then the other breast. When there was no objection, a hand pulled down her dress and bra, exposing her breasts to anyone who happened to look in their direction. Then he leaned down and began kissing her breasts as she seemed to melt. After a few moments, her eyes suddenly shot open. She pushed him away, and quickly returned her magnificent breasts back to the confines of her bra and dress. She became visibly angry and pushed him away, giving him a verbal beating. At the same time, he remained impassive until she finally ran out of steam, and he sat silently and smiled at her. For a few more moments, then, smiling like a Cheshire cat, he shrugged and launched into what looked like the publicity stunt of the century. She listened with an angry face until what he was saying finally improved her mood, and a small smile appeared on her face. Whatever he said must have worked. In the end, each one smiled at the other, although Lynn sometimes shook her head. He must have played his big card after all because, although I didn't hear a word he said, it was obvious that she had finally reluctantly agreed to what he was selling. What happened next was the most shocking thing I have ever seen in my life. Lynn slid sideways into the booth until her back was against the wall and propped her feet up on the seat so she was facing them and her back to the outside end of the booth. Looking around the room as far as she could see from the back of the booth, she lifted her dress up to her waist, revealing her bare legs and the turquoise lace panties she was wearing. Will stared at her like a little kid in a candy store, grinning from ear to ear and bouncing contentedly in place. She then started to pull her panties down. I sat in paralyzed silence. So far, I'd been able to explain Lynn's actions as just a whim of the moment, a kiss, and a little body rubbing, the result of too much drinking, disappointment in me for not coming with her, and a long wait to possibly meet her ex-guy. I could still quite come to terms with what had happened up to this point. Now, I had serious doubts that my marriage would last through the night. Pain, humiliation, and anger washed over me in alternating waves as I sat silently and watched. Under the gaze, she slipped out of her panties. She returned to a sitting position on the bench and handed the elegant piece of clothing to the now grinning Will. He leaned slightly in her direction, took a deep breath, and made a remark that made Lynn's face red and earned him a good-natured slap to the face. With these words, she asked him to move away and headed to the ladies' room. Will looked at the evening's prize and placed it in the inside pocket of his sports jacket and then started doing those "it's time to go" moves. Finally, I recovered from the shock and was able to move and breathe again. It's time to take some action before this goes any further. Looking around, I found that there was no one in the bar except the bartender and the three of us. This is good because if the situation gets out of hand, witnesses will become a real nuisance. I motioned to the bartender, and he sauntered over to where I was sitting. I pointed my thumb over my shoulder towards the last booth. "Mike, bring these two lovebirds a drink at my expense." "Okay, but change the ladies' drink from gin and tonic to Bailey's on the rocks." Bailey's on the rocks was what Lynn drank as the last drink of the evening when we went out. She said it calmed her stomach and saved her from a hangover. I always thought it was, but it seemed to work for her. But what the hell, then I put another $20 on the table. While Mike did his thing and took the drink to Lynn, she appeared just as Mike was explaining where the drinks came from and to whom. He pointed in my direction. As he explained, Will saw me and thought I was just a drunk from the bar making a friendly gesture. But Lynn had a strange look on her face as she alternated her gaze between the Baileys and me. I didn't turn around. I just looked in the mirror from under my baseball cap. Lynn and the others were sitting next to each other in a booth and exchanged a few words when he shouted to me, "Hey buddy, why don't you come over and have a drink with us? We're just about to leave, but we wanted to thank you for your generosity." I slid off the bar stool and sauntered over to them, keeping my shirt collar up and my baseball cap pulled down over my eyes. When I approached the table, he stood up and extended his hand for a handshake. "My name is Will, and this is Lynn." I pushed my cap to the back of my head, straightened up, not accepting the outstretched hand, and looking straight into Lynn's eyes, answered, "Hello, honey, are you having a good time?" There was absolute stunned silence for a moment. Then Lynn turned white as a ghost, let out a strangled cry, and dropped her glass, breaking it and splattering Bailey's all over the table and her dress. He immediately realized who I was and stood silently, opening and closing his mouth like a carp at the bottom of a fishing boat. If I hadn't been so angry, I would have laughed out loud. The look of panic on both faces was more than comical. I don't know what I looked like, but whatever it was, it must not have conveyed a feeling of joy. And smiling, Lynn backed into the booth as far as she could, and her companion for the evening looked like he was about to jump out. "Do you mind if I sit down?" I asked kindly, and without waiting for an answer, sat down opposite. After another second or two of silence, Lynn found her voice and began a rapidly babbling string of questions. "Jim, what are you doing here? Why didn't you tell me you were coming? How long have you been here? What you?" He simply turned his head, looking first at me and then at the exit from this establishment, the expression on his face alternating between fear and belligerence. I raised my hand for silence, cutting Lynn off in the middle of what she was trying to say. "Hey guys, calm down. Let's just sit for a minute and get to know each other. What do you say? If we have another drink?" Then I turned and motioned for Mike to come over. The two now sat in stony silence, their minds racing to understand what I was up to. "Mike, get us another drink," and then, in the most sarcastic tone I could muster, "And do you have anything we can use to clean up this mess?" My wife was so happy to see me that she spilled her drink. Then I turned to her companion and, smiling my best salesman smile, extended my hand. "We don't know each other. I'm Jim Thornton, Lynn's husband." He took my hand in a short squeeze like a hot horseshoe. "I'm Will Hart, Lynn's former classmate. I came to the alumni meeting, so this is you, the famous Will Hart. Well, it's good that we can finally put a face and a name together." I didn't go into detail, but I'm sure my fake sincerity didn't escape him. After a second or two, when I hadn't said anything else, Will spoke up. "I don't really need another drink. I haven't touched the first one, and it looks like you and Lynn need some alone time together." "No, old man, stay where you are," I answered calmly but with a clear hint of poison in my voice. "My wife and I need to discuss something, but for such a close friend as you, nothing is secret." By this time, the tension had become so strong that you could feel it on your skin. Lynn went completely silent and just looked at me in absolute panic. He tried to look anywhere but at me. Mike finally finished clearing the table and returned to the far end of the counter. He clearly sensed my need for privacy. Taking a long sip of cold beer, I put the glass on the table and looked intently at Lynn. "Well, Lynn, what were you saying?" She flinched at my question and began, "What are you doing here?" "I came to see my beautiful wife and protect my territory, but it seems a little late," I answered, winking slightly at Will. Lynn caught the wink and spoke, "Jim, it's not what it looks like. I can explain everything. We were just having drinks and talking about old times when Will and I were classmates, and we hadn't seen each other since the summer of our graduation. We didn't do anything wrong. Yes, man, we drank quietly and made up for lost time over the past 20 years. Lord, how guilty the couple looks. We were just reminiscing about old times, right? The old days must have been pretty exciting." Lynn began to cry and nervously fiddled with her wedding rings. He took a long sip from his glass and stared at the table, trying not to meet my gaze. "Jim, I know it looks a little funny, but nothing is happening. We just had a little drink, danced a little, and talked about our school days. Honestly, that's all we did." Looking at Will, I asked, "Is it true, Will? You were just having a friendly drink and chatting a little here, alone with my wife?" I emphasized every word, and this did not escape them, since both immediately nodded their heads affirmatively and at the same time that it was so. I watched silently, looking from one to the other without saying a word. Until now, I had not raised my voice, made no accusations, or broken anything, so there was a noticeable shift in their behavior towards relaxation. Not much, but enough to say that each of them interpreted my actions as a sign that I was in the dark about what they were up to. Do they think I'm just a stupid husband being kept in the dark and cuckolded? The thought racing through my head was, how far did Lynn plan to let him go? Was he really going to take her to Bob and Maggie, or were they going to go somewhere more secluded? For unknown reasons, did Lynn decide to go to bed with this idiot? Has she already slept with him? How long have they been planning this? Does she love him, and is our love and marriage over? And for Will, well, I've met enough of them to know that what happened between him and Lynn was much more than memories of old times. He was actively planning and organizing everything to get her into bed, plain and simple. So far, I have successfully held back and remained calm. I could accept that it was just a one-time mistake when there was too much to drink and slow music playing. I could probably also understand him grabbing her and grinding against her on the dance floor. But pulling out her breasts and fondling them with an ongoing hug in the booth, and the way she took off her panties and gave them to him, went far beyond anything understandable, acceptable, or forgivable. Internally, my mind was screaming, to hell with common understanding, but I needed to determine what was really going on, so I maintained my stupid grin and disdainful appearance. I sat up very straight and leaned forward, staring at them both across the table. Then, focusing on his wife, he said, "Well, honey, tell me about the reunion. Are you having a good time? Besides Bob, Maggie, and old Will, did any of your other close friends show up?" Lynn and Will relaxed even more as my obvious interest turned from their personal relationships and current circumstances to general issues regarding the homecoming. The idea had obviously become firmly established in their minds that I did not suspect anything unusual. They successfully explained the intimacy in which I found them by my sudden appearance, since it seemed that I was in the dark about their earlier intimate relations and the transfer of panties. In an effort to steer me away from anything that might pique my curiosity, Lynn launched into an overly detailed account of the reunion and the events of the day. I just smiled and listened. From time to time, Will would add some detail or talk about some event, but mostly he was silent. To be honest, I got the impression that he would like to become invisible and disappear. In the end, she had nothing more to say to me, and the strangeness of my sudden appearance returned to her again. She ended with, "That's all for now. The actual functions of the meeting will be completed over the next few days, and that's when most of the class is expected to show up. Now, tell me, what are you doing here? Is there some reason why I shouldn't be here?" "Well, no, but you refused to come with me because your company had this problem with the end of the world that was more important than anyone or anything else in your life, so your appearance is a bit of a shock," she replied, with a slight hint of aggression. "Did you finish earlier than expected?" "No. I'm not finished yet. Just thinking about how I'm breaking my promise to you by leaving you here alone. When I really thought about it, I suddenly had a very dark feeling about not being there for you. So I told my boss that he could either let me go, or I would quit. It didn't matter to me what he did, but I was going to leave, and here I am," I answered with all the feigned sincerity I could muster. Now, Lynn looked at me with genuine concern. She knew that I had a very good job, and she liked the reward of a large income. She could quit her job and stay home with the kids, have the house she wanted in the neighborhood she liked, plus everything else. My coming here despite the consequences now shed a whole new light on the situation, and the way I acted was more than a little out of character. God, I hope this doesn't cause any problems with your work. The potential cost of my stay here slowly began to dawn on Lynn. Perhaps coming to the high school reunion wasn't as important as she thought. "How did you two find this place?" I asked out of the blue, looking around as if I was seeing this place for the first time. I wanted to shift the conversation to what's happening here. Lynn chimed in, explaining that this was a typical drinking spot frequented by locals during their school days. Today, they came here with Bob, Maggie, and another couple since they lived in Riverdale and were regulars here. "Will, why did you come to the meeting so early? Do you have family here in Riverdale?" No, Lynn no longer has family here, but she wanted to come a few days early to visit her old friend Maggie. I waited for his answer as if I was sincerely interested in him. Startled, Will cast an almost imperceptible glance at Lynn. "Yes, my parents live here in retirement, and I came to spend a week with them before the start of the homecoming events. I didn't expect to see my classmates before, so you can imagine my surprise when I ran into Lynn and Maggie at the mall yesterday. Lynn's eyes widened, and she flinched at Will's offhand comment. She knew that I was aware that he was coming to the homecoming and that he had called Lynn a few weeks ago to chat. This guy didn't know when to keep his mouth shut. I looked straight at Lynn, who stared at me like a child who had been caught in the cookie jar. As I understand it, you were friends with Maggie and Lynn at school. What was Lynn like at that time? I talked to her like a conspirator, trying to find out secrets. Didn't she have a mouth full of braces? Did she have a lot of freckles and braids? I grinned with every moment of my conversation with Will. Lynn became noticeably more tense with each passing moment. He had already lied once, and the longer he spoke, the greater the risk that he would be caught again. For my part, I continued to play the dumb husband. Come on, Jim, stop asking Will about his personal life and especially about him trying to remember me when we were in high school. It was a long time ago. So, you still had braces, freckles, and pigtails. You know, Will, before we met, she didn't tell me about herself at all. I mean, her mom told me about stuff when she was little in family events, but not things that only friends would know, like old boyfriends and stuff like that. She always claimed that she was too shy to talk about herself. The more Will talked, the more he relaxed, and the more he relaxed, the more Lynn tightened. His general description of Lynn in middle school was that she was cute and sweet but self-conscious about her braces, freckles, etc., and that she was into horses. She was even a member of the school's FFA chapter. She didn't date for the most part until the end of her senior year because she was a late bloomer, both physically and socially. It turned out that Will's parents owned a large farm near the city, and he was also a member of FFA. I pretended to hang on his every word, laughed at all the funny moments, and we compared football stories when the topic came up. Lynn sat mostly in uneasy silence, occasionally objecting to something Will said or adding a little to the story. She wasn't happy about being the topic of conversation. His last story about Lynn was about an FFA-sponsored hay wagon ride at the end of their senior year, just before graduation. As soon as he mentioned the joy trip, Lynn turned pale and tense and then loudly asked him not to tell the story. I, of course, encouraged her to tell the story. Lynn didn't drink at all, but she was teased into drinking the cheap fruit wine the boys smuggled on the trip. After taking a sip, she decided that the drink was pretty good after all, and as the evening went on, she became considerably less reserved. As she sat in the back of the van, no details were mentioned about what less restrained meant, but her personal participation in the evening's activities was interrupted when she vomited on another girl. Will and two other boys. The adult chaperone intervened and eventually called Lynn's parents. Her parents were unhappy, and consequently, she was punished with house arrest for the rest of the year, except for graduation ceremonies. She wasn't allowed to see or talk to Will or any of the other students on the van ride. And so, she hadn't seen or spoken to him since, other than hurried goodbyes and yearbook signings on the last day of classes. By telling this story, many answers fell into place for me. I laughed at the story like it was the funniest thing in the world and commented that Lynn still doesn't drink alcohol. Will softened and smiled like the cat that ate the canary. Lynn kept looking at me for any signs of concern, and I simply winked back at her. Girl, wait until I tell our friends at home about this. Damn it, Jim, don't you dare tell that story. It'll embarrass me to death, Lynn. I bet you throwing up on that joyride wasn't the highlight of the evening, was it? I answered in a tone devoid of humor. Lynn turned pale, if that was even possible. Will suddenly seemed less relaxed, and I wasn't smiling at all. The story was funny, but my comment brought everyone back to the present. Suddenly, it became very quiet, the discomfort became palpable. Will, let me out, I need to go to the ladies' room. Lynn broke the silence and almost pushed him out of the stall, hurrying to get to the door with a large F sign in the middle. Lynn stomped purposefully across the dance floor and disappeared into that inner sanctum where women retreat when stressed. Will and I watched her go until she disappeared. I guess I better get out of here. It's getting late, and I'm having a hard time sleeping in this damn motel I'm staying at off the freeway, Will announced. I thought you were staying with your parents. I'm staying in the city. I love them very much, but it's impossible to be alone in my parents' house, His comment instantly brought my anger back to the surface, and I thought to myself, yeah, he's an idiot, for example, for bringing home someone else's wife and getting her into bed. I'll walk you to the door. I need some fresh air, and as far as I know, Lynn, she's locking herself in the bathroom for half an hour until she gets over her embarrassment about the whole trip thing. I laughed as we headed toward the side door into the parking lot. I called out to Mike, "Hey, Mike, I'm leaving in a few minutes. Bring me those notes, okay?" He nodded in response, stood up from his chair, and headed into the back room. Will walked out the door, and I followed him into the nearly empty parking lot, still only my rental car and my 2-year-old BMW. Perhaps in an attempt to make idle conversation or suddenly having a vague recollection, Will turned to me and casually asked, "What records do you want from Mike?" "Oh, CCTV footage on the dance floor and in the booth where you sat tonight," I answered as casually as possible and waited. Soon a light came on in Will's head, and he turned to me with an expression of understanding and concern. Walking out the door, I let go of the control I had been holding over the anger I had been holding all evening and let the dog off the leash. The surge of adrenaline was intoxicating. "Hey, Jim," was all he had time to say before I punched him in the stomach as hard as I could with my right fist, after which I stood in front of his nose and growled like an angry dog. "Listen here, idiot, you will not receive any prize from my wife. Not tonight and never while she is my wife. If this little interlude results in me and her breaking up, then after that, you can do whatever you want with her. But you need to know something. If Lynn and I get divorced because of this, I will hunt you down and put you down for a long time in the hospital. If we stay for this meeting over the next few days and I just find you at the same end of the room as her, I will beat you like a drum. You understand me?" He shook his head up and down but didn't make a sound other than trying to suck in air, trying to regain his breath. "One more question. Did you sleep with her in high school?" "No, she got sick before we got this far," he choked. "Have you slept with her since she's been here?" "No." "Did you plan to do this tonight?" "Yes." "I'll ask you one more question or two. If you don't tell the truth, I'll beat the crap out of you, understand?" I nudged him lightly with my need to get his attention. "Did she agree to go to your room and have with you, or did she indicate to you that she would do so?" "Not really." "What the hell does that mean?" He rolled his eyes as if he wanted to avoid answering but knew he couldn't. "That was the promise she made to me on that trip before she got sick in middle school. I collected panties as prizes from my conquests, but before I could get her into bed that night, she started puking all over everyone. Tonight I persuaded her to give me the prize for old time's sake." I slapped him on the cheek to get his attention, then opened the car door and pushed him into the driver's seat. "Get your back to the motel and put some ice on your nose and eyes. You're not really that hurt, but remember what I said. If you start hitting wedges again, you will be seriously injured. Think twice before approaching a married woman in the future. Sooner or later, you will be killed." With that, I slammed the door and stepped back, watching as he started the car and drove away. I had cooled down to an acceptable level, but my heart was breaking. Even though Will said that Lynn ultimately rejected his attempts to seduce her, she nevertheless crossed boundaries that a married woman should not cross. I had already decided what I was going to do, so I put the green lace panties in my pocket and went back to the bar. Lynn came out of the ladies' room just as I was handing another Benjamin to bartender Mike for the tapes. Luckily, he put them in a bag, so she had no idea what they were. She came up to me and looked around. "Where's Will?" He suddenly didn't feel very well and decided to return home. She looked at me puzzled but didn't say anything. "Are you ready for another drink?" "I don't think I want anything else to drink. I've got Baileys all over my clothes, and I'm a little in the mood to continue the party." Her last remark almost put me over the edge. She was in a good mood to continue the party until her boyfriend disappeared, and then she doesn't feel like celebrating with her husband. The only thing I could do was not grab her and shake her until her teeth chattered. "Well, I want another drink, even though it has nothing to do with the party, so just sit on your cute little," I hissed, shocked by my sudden change. She sat up abruptly and looked at me wearily. There's no point in behaving so disgustingly. "Hey, Mike, bring me another beer," I shouted to the bartender. The bar was empty, and my voice echoed throughout the hall where it was so quiet. Mike looked like he really wanted us to go home so he could have some closure during the evening. I gave him so many tips that he could easily remain open until I got ready to go home. He must have felt the same way because he brought another beer and placed it in front of me on the house. On the house, he muttered and returned to his perch at the opposite end of the bar. Of course, it was an old neighborhood place, and I hadn't gotten a beer on the house since I was in high school. I took a sip and sat down, looking at Lynn expectantly. When there was silence, she fidgeted nervously in her chair. "Jim, why are you acting so strange? You show up unannounced, make everyone feel awkward, and then just stare at me like I'm a bug under a microscope. What the hell is going on?" "I want to know, damn it." She was losing the battle with composure. I realized that the important moment had arrived, and I took another long, slow sip of my beer, looking my wife straight in the eyes. "Okay." I put my hand in my pocket as casually as possible and threw the panties I had taken from Will into the middle of the table. "I found them in your former classmate Will's jacket pocket. They are yours, aren't they? These are the same ones you were wearing when you arrived here tonight, right?" Then I sat down and waited. She turned pale and stared at the lace rag lying in the middle of the table as if at a rattlesnake. She alternated between looking at the panties and then at me and back again until she began to stutter. "Jim, I don't know what that was." All she had time to say before I reached across the table and pulled down the top of her dress enough to expose the bra that matched the panties. "In front of us. These are your panties, aren't they, Lynn?" She turned away and covered her mouth with her hands as if she was going to be sick but did not answer. "Damn it, Lynn, are these your panties or not?" I almost shouted in her face, holding them right in front of her eyes so that she couldn't help but notice them. She turned away from me and squeezed out with anguish, "I don't know," after which the tears began to flow in large quantities. At this point, I lost my patience. "I don't need to talk nonsense anymore, Lynn. They are part of the set, matching the bra you are wearing." "I know because this is the gift I gave you for your last birthday." Now I was in full attack mode. "I saw how you dancing rubbed against this. I saw how you wet your tonsils and exchanged saliva with him on the dance floor and in this booth. I saw him pull out your breasts and fondle them, and last but not least, I saw you take off those panties and hand them over to him." I abandoned all semblance of restraint or control, and as my voice and tempo of speech increased, she flinched at every word as if she was being whipped. I took the cassette out of my bag and threw it right in front of her. "If your memory has become bad, maybe this will help refresh it. Here's the security camera footage that recorded everything that happened at this end of Clancy over the last 6 hours." At this point, she burst into violent sobs as it was obvious that she had been caught big time. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The came to light. I paused for a second to catch my breath, and she weakly tried to formulate a response to my tirade. I cut her off and then continued in a calmer but no less vindictive tone. "I understand you've been planning for weeks to meet and pick up where you left off in high school and sleep with him. The only reason you didn't go to his motel room right now to have with him is because I showed up and ruined the party. Instead of being happy about me, you acted as if I was trespassing where I was not supposed to. Well, Lynn, if I catch my flight home tomorrow, I'll head straight to the law office and divorce your cheating. You don't have to worry about going home. You can pick up right where you left off 20 years ago here in Riverdale with dear old classmate Will. I will explain to the children that you decided that our family is not worth the old love that you did not finish while you were in high school with that last flash." All my energy left me, all emotions washed away except for a vague feeling of sadness. I leaned back in my chair and stared blankly across the table at the woman who was my partner and the love of my life. She let out an almost primal scream, and the tears flowed nonstop. "No, Jim, no, you can't think like that. I love you. Why would you do such a thing? It's not what you think." The floodgates were open, and she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "Sorry, please let me explain." I sat in silence, watching her scream as if the life had been ripped out of her body. Seeing her in such pain tore me up inside. I've loved her since our first date, every day, every special event, I loved her more and more. With the birth of our children, with our first new home, she was my friend, lover, confidant, and guardian, all wrapped up in this amazing package. I always thought she felt the same way about me. Sitting here, wallowing in self-pity, it seemed like I was so obviously wrong. I sat silently and watched her emotions run their course. I offered no consolation, no sympathy, no assistance. There were no more shouts, screams, or accusations, no violence or threats. I just sat in silence. She was in pain for which she was responsible, and she would have to deal with it eventually. She ran out of tears and sat quietly with her head in her hands, not looking at me. Her silence brought me out of my stupor, my growing consciousness strangely filled with guilt and remorse. Looking at her melancholy and hopelessness, I stupidly thought, did I do the right thing? Wasn't I too harsh? The fog cleared to the point where I could think again. So I walked up to the bar and said quietly to Mike, "Hey, Mike, can I get a clean damp cloth and a big glass of water?" As he retrieved what he needed, I was struck by the stunning silence of the place and the strange shadows cast by the neon beer signs now that most of the lights were off. The numbness and lack of noise reminded me of the feeling you get at the end of a long drive when everything is quiet except for the ringing in your ears. I returned to the booth, sat down next to Lynn, and tilting her head back, carefully washed her face with a cold damp cloth, wiping away the mascara and the streaks of tears. Then I handed her a glass of water. She looked completely devoid of any spark of life or energy. After she had drunk, I sat back on my side of the booth and silently watched her motionless figure. We sat like that for a very long time. The silence was broken by Mike, who approached with an apologetic look. "Sorry to interfere, but it's time for me to close." I fished out my shrinking money clip and handed him another 100. "Can we sit here for another 30 minutes until you close? Leaving right now would actually be bad for us." He looked at the bar, then at the money, and finally at Lynn. "Of course, but I'll turn off the lights and lock the doors. I don't want to attract late-night drunks who might want to come in for a nightcap. Thanks, I appreciate it." Mike left and got to work locking the building. Lynn stood up, clasping her head in her hands and looking searchingly into my face, said in a thin voice, "I didn't mean to hurt you. I know this evening looks bad, but it's not what you think. I didn't come to Riverdale to have with Will, and I would never have with him, no matter what." I thought about what she was saying and what she said earlier in the evening. "Okay, Lynn, you keep saying that this is not what I think, that this is not what it looks like, so explain to me." She took a deep breath and let out a long shaky exhale, then sat up straighter in her chair. "Please don't be angry and let me finish before you say anything. I'll be completely honest. If you have any questions when I'm done, I'll answer them without trying to wriggle out or obfuscate in any way. Please, do it, okay? I'll do my best, Jim. The most important thing is that you know that I love you and only you. I have always loved and will always love you. Now, I know it's hard to believe from your perspective, but it's true. What you saw here tonight between Will and me was just a spontaneous moment, something that grew out of a bunch of little circumstances that came together at the same time." She stopped to take a long sip of water, watching me carefully the whole time, perhaps waiting for a reaction. I sat impassively, not wanting to miss anything and not wanting to influence what she had to say. I've been looking forward to this reunion for a long time, and to be honest, mostly for very selfish reasons. When I first received my homecoming notice 9 months ago, it dawned on me that I graduated from high school 20 years ago. More than half of my life has passed since then, and I suddenly felt very old and leaving the stage. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw extra bulges, wrinkles, bags under my eyes, and it hit my self-esteem hard. You weren't the most attentive lover in the world for a while, and I thought to myself, no wonder, look how you've done. Who can be delighted by an old-fashioned, middle-aged housewife wife? I was depressed. But the upcoming reunion and the promise of seeing my friends again gave me the kick in the to do something about it. I started watching what I ate and going to women's Pilates classes until I was down 42 kilograms to what I was when we got married. I thought I was making real progress and looking pretty good, but you didn't say anything, didn't change your attitude towards me, and all you cared about was your job and company. This infuriated me, and I slowly began to boil over the fact that you were not paying attention to me and were taking me for granted. When you canceled your trip to meet me, that was the last straw. I decided that I would go alone and have a good time. Now, before you say anything, no, I didn't plan on being wild and pretending to be single, but I fully intended to have a good time, including dancing, dinner, and a few drinks with old classmates from CL. I decided that although I am old and married, I am not dead. I kind of took a time out from being a mother and wife with all the accompanying activities and responsibilities. I'm telling you this now so you know what kind of mood I was in when I left. She stopped and looked at me as if expecting some kind of answer or comment. When I didn't say anything, she continued. Obviously, I need to explain myself. About Will in high school, he was a real find. He was good-looking, quarterback of the football team, homecoming king. On the other hand, for most of high school, I was a short, boyish girl with braces and freckles. None of the boys even looked at me, let alone Will Hart. We heard all these stories. He was in great demand among the ladies, and they lined up for him. I could only dream about dating him, and this continued for most of high school. My senior year changed all this. I began, as they say, to bloom. I got all the right spots filled in, my braces came off, and my freckles didn't seem that big of a deal anymore. The big problem was my complete lack of experience up to this point, and my parents watching me like hawks. I joined FFA because I was crazy about horses. Will joined because his parents owned a big farm east of Riverdale, and all the farm kids seemed to join FFA as a matter of course. Suddenly, after Christmas break of my senior year, Will, the girl terror as we secretly called him, began to notice me and from time to time stopped to chat amicably. I was the most excited student at Roosevelt High just because he was talking to me. During this time, I managed to go on dates with several other guys, but he never asked me out. I was still very shy and was often teased for having a secret crush on him. She stopped to take another sip of water. My story, for lack of a better term, with Will was short and incomplete. It happened at the FFA graduation for high school students. Each year, the FFA director would take the high school students on a hay wagon ride around town, ending with a party and dance at school. I found myself in the very back of the wagon under the straw with Will and half a dozen other really popular high school boys and girls. Will was very attentive, giving me all his attention, and I found myself in a one-on-one situation with Will amidst the storm of girls. I was included in the popular inner circle, and my head was spinning with surprise. One of the boys took out a large bottle of fruit wine. Until that moment, I had never drunk alcoholic beverages and timidly refused when they offered me a bottle. The others began to tease me about being a good girl and a child, so naturally, I relented and drank. It tasted a lot like fizzy soft drink, so I drank more. The bottle was passed around a couple of times, and soon I felt dizzy, and everything seemed out of focus. Will put his arm around me, and we started just talking, holding hands. Then a little teasing exhalation into my ear, and finally, a whole lot of kissing and hugging. I was a complete newbie to this boys and girls thing, and Will was very smooth and experienced. It was subtle and slow at first, but suddenly his tongue was halfway down my throat, and he pulled out my breast. I was shocked. I had never done anything like this before. I screamed for him to stop and pulled away. He simply smiled and looked around at the others, took another sip of wine from the bottle, then handed it to me. I remember that I was embarrassed to act like a little child, so I took another big sip. After that, I don't remember anything except that I had very new and pleasant sensations happening in my body. Lynn fell silent, her mouth opened and closed a couple of times, but no words came out. She was clearly in a difficult situation. Jim, it's hard for me to talk about this. We never really talked about our experiences before we got married, and I feel terribly uncomfortable doing this, Lynn. While neither of us was what you'd call experienced when we got married, we weren't complete virgins either. The moment we decided we loved each other and would get married, everything we did before we met was accepted as our past. Besides, we should now know each other well enough to talk about anything without trepidation. I feel comfortable telling you things, and I'm disappointed that you don't feel the same way about telling me things. Maybe if we had been more open with each other, this conversation would not be happening now. After that, I fell silent and looked at her again, waiting for her to continue. She again began fiddling with her rings, and then, without looking at me, she continued her story from where she left off. My mind disconnected from my body as I was aware of what Will was doing, but I didn't seem to have the ability to resist. We hugged for a while, and Will became bolder and bolder until he unbuttoned my blouse and started kissing my breasts. No one had ever done this before, and my body loved it, even as my mind screamed at it to stop, that it was wrong. Finally, I emerged from the fog while he was ready to have with me. When I realized what it was, my conscience finally overcame my desire and I tried to get up. When he tried to hold me, I began to resist even more, and something in my body must have not liked the sudden movement because I vomited right in his face because of all the screaming and yelling. When the teacher in charge of the team stopped to find out what was going on, I remember desperately pulling my panties up before the teacher could get to where we were, all the while emptying the last of the contents of my stomach on everyone within a couple of meters. You know the rest of the story. The teacher called my parents, and I was taken home in complete embarrassment and put under house arrest forever. I only saw Will once after that, during our graduation ceremony and for a few minutes after. He joked a little about how I felt bad and that I missed the thrill of getting my first from him. He also said that I owed him panties as a prize, even though we didn't actually have. He even wrote about it in my yearbook. But if you don't know the history, you won't find out the details, and this is the whole story about me and Will, she said, concluding her story. That's all that can be said. Then she looked expectantly into my eyes and began to wait. I returned her gaze for a moment before saying, "This is some kind of fiction, Lynn." "This is not fiction, Jim. This is the truth. This is how it all happened. I'm not making this up. Believe me. I didn't have with Will, and I actually threw up on him," she said, pleadingly. "Oh, I believe you. I'm sure that everything happened exactly like that. Then why do you look like you think I'm lying?" "Because I don't care what you may or may not have done with your old boyfriend at school. This was long before we got married, and strictly speaking, it is none of my business. I'm worried about what you've done these past few days. I'm especially worried about what happened here tonight. First of all, tonight is the first night since I arrived in Riverdale that Will and I have been alone together. We went out as a group. We were all together, and I returned home with Bob and Maggie. You can ask them if you want to check. Yes, so what? What I saw here tonight is reason enough to pack up and head home alone. Whether you dated him last night, tonight, or later this week doesn't matter. For weeks, you had been planning to meet him, and it wasn't just to reminisce about old times. Do you really think I'm that stupid, Jim? I admit that I had planned to see Will while I was here and was looking forward to it, but the thought of with him never, ever crossed my mind. Tonight, everything happened as if by chance. We all relaxed and talked about what happened while we were in school and were having a good time. I'd had a little too much to drink, and by the time the others had decided to go home, I was in the mood for some fun. Will said he would stay with me and then take me to Bob and Maggie. As we talked and danced, I seemed to be transported back 20 years, and I guess for a while, I was 18 again and in high school again. That's all it was. I regret what happened and admit that I made a mistake, but there was no or promise. I swear. Nothing should have happened. She looked at me with pain and tears. I don't blame you for being angry, but I love you and only you. Please don't talk about breaking up our marriage because of this. It's not that serious. We sat for a while and looked at each other in silence, Lynn trying to read some sign on my face that her request had been successful, and I, in turn, trying to understand what was going on in her head. Is she telling the truth? What actually happened in the last month leading up to this moment? While my mind went over what Lynn had told me and what I had seen this evening, I idly listened as Mike locked the doors and stocked up on beer for tomorrow's customers. Strange things that distract attention. Lynn, if you think that what I saw with Will tonight wasn't something serious, then I believe that you and I have a significant gap in our basic beliefs about what it means to be married. It may have been not that serious to you, but to me, it was as serious as a damn heart attack. Did you really think I wouldn't mind you dancing in the dark, grinding against him, and trading spit with that smarmy son of a? What reasoning made you think that if he stuck his tongue down your throat and tore at your breasts, that was normal? By this time, I had lost control of myself again and attacked her with renewed pain and anger. She answered my interrogation with obvious pain. "Jim, please stop. I had no plan to do anything against you and our marriage. I just got carried away for a moment, but kept everything under control. It was just hard to concentrate between the drinking and the desire to be young again, at least for a little while. I already told you that there were no plans for, and regardless of my state of mind, there would be no. I would never allow this. Will knows that I'm happily married, have a family, and I'm sure he respects that." Then she looked at me, tears rolling down her cheeks. I lifted my panties and held them in front of her. "Do you know where I got them?" She turned away, lowered her head, and whispered, "No. I took them from Will. They were in his jacket pocket." I sat and watched as you pulled your legs up on the booth seat, lifting up your dress. She pulled them down to her feet and handed them to him. I responded with the pace and determination of a teacher instructing a small child. I really mean what we've talked about up to this point, but it all pales in comparison to you taking off your panties and giving them to another man. Strangely enough, I found myself in a zone where my mind was telling me I had all the time, space, and power I needed in the world. I had patience. I was calm. I controlled myself, and whatever happened, it would happen according to my will. So, Lynn, do you want to explain why you gave the panties to your old waiting to hear her side of the story mate Will, who you were not planning to sleep with? I fell silent. Finally, she answered in a voice barely above a whisper, because I promised. What do you mean anything special? At that moment, I regretted that I let go of in the parking lot so easily and promised myself that if the opportunity presented itself, I would correct my mistake. You know what he needed, don't you, Lynn? Yes. Well, say so. Say this so that later, when we try to sort out this nonsense, there will be no misunderstandings between us. He hinted that he wanted to have with me, but I made it clear that this will not happen. Made it clear? Did you make it clear? This son of a didn't hint at anything. He was on a deliberate campaign to get into your pants. Made it clear, you say? Damn it, Lynn, are you really that damn naive? I was on edge again. Once I had everything under control, she pushed the right buttons to drive me crazy again. No, Jim, this shouldn't have happened. I told him no way. I told him that if he continued like this, I would call a taxi and go home and never see or speak to him again. In the end, he agreed that if I gave him the panties, he would forget about it. And you did what he asked? I asked, shaking my head in surprise. Yes. I didn't want to hurt his feelings, and after all, I promised him that he would receive his prize. She answered in such a way that it sounded noble and logical. Jim, I gave my word. Then she sat down and looked at me expectantly, as if she had just explained everything. I sat stunned for a moment, unable to believe what I had just heard. Lynn, do you think I'm the dumbest in the world, or are you the most naive 38-year-old woman on the entire planet? No, Jim, I know for sure that you are far from stupid, and I may have been a little slow in understanding Will's plan, but I think you're making a mountain out of a molehill. I'm sorry for letting things get a little out of hand. Okay, so let's leave it at that, please. Eventually, my anger subsided a little, and I listened to all this crap. I leaned forward over the table so that we were looking into each other's eyes. Okay, Lynn, there seems to be something here that's eluding you, so I'll get it straight. You described your actions here tonight as not very serious and that things were just slightly out of control. Well, you should think about how serious they might be for me because as far as I'm concerned, you cheated on me and broke your marriage vows. I mentioned divorce for a reason, so it's time for you to wake up and really understand what's going on here, I continued. I will not share any part of you with another man, not mind, body, or soul. What you did here tonight with your old boyfriend is absolutely, without exception, unacceptable and intolerable to me as your husband. And this nonsense about you giving him a word that you should have kept, to hell with it. You didn't mean to offend him, damn his feelings. I don't care about the promises you made to him. Our marriage vows nullify every promise you ever made to that son of a. Now I was on a roll, and there was no holding back or compromising. I thought she was all done crying, but tears appeared in her eyes again when I continued the attack. Jim, please, no more. No, you wait to hear everything. Are you saying that part of this was because I was too busy with my work to pay any attention to you? You damn sure didn't mind the luxury house, new cars, and prestigious area that you simply needed. Where do you think the money comes from to pay for all this crap, Lynn? This is due to the high stress of a full-time job that I deal with every minute of my life. And what did you do to make me interested in you? What steps have you ever taken to make me pay attention to you, to feel more attracted to you? Damn it, you acted like you didn't care if I liked you or not. On another note, how would you feel if our roles were reversed, and my old college friend, Marianne Laporte, and I were sitting here tonight, and you were watching us from the bar? Would you consider me swapping saliva with Marianne and fondling her big breasts as nothing serious? What would you think if you saw her take off her panties and give them to me as a prize? I've often wondered if she was blonde all over. Would you enjoy watching me check it out for myself for my own sake? Is it okay if I tell you that I'm just going back in time for a while because I'm starting to feel old and not as handsome as I was in middle school, that I need a little break from my marriage to boost my self-esteem a little and feel better? With these words, I stopped to give her the opportunity to say something, but she was completely unable to answer. Well, Lynn, say something. After long, painful minutes, she found her voice. What can I say? You are absolutely right. I didn't think about it in any context related to you or our marriage. In my head, it was just innocent fun. I thought a little dirty dancing and everything else, as long as I didn't have with him, was just a little naughty and frivolous. And the thought of you doing all this with Marianne Laporte is simply unbearable. If our roles had been reversed, I would have been devastated. With this confession, she fell silent with a painful look that spoke eloquently of the confusion she was experiencing. I gave her a moment to let everything settle before speaking again. The anger was gone, the fire in my belly was gone, and all I felt was loss and regret. What are you going to do now, Lynn? Where do we go from here? What do you mean, where do we go from here? I'll do whatever you want. Just say it. As far as I understand, we have two options, and which path we take depends on you. First of all, if you think that what you did with Will is within the bounds of acceptable behavior while in a marriage and I'm being unreasonable, then you can continue to attend your homecoming here in Riverdale as planned. In the morning, I will catch my flight back home and begin the divorce process as quickly as I can. I told you that I don't want to share you with anyone else, and if this is too hard, then no matter how much I love you, we should break free from each other and go our separate ways. I can't live with the idea of my wife needing a break from our marriage and being mildly wicked, as you described it. To be honest, I wouldn't expect to get much comfort from Will because I told him that as long as we were married, I would beat him to a pulp if I caught him in the same room with you. After we get divorced, maybe you two can move in together and figure out what you've been missing. Jim, don't say that. I love you and want to be your wife forever. I feel nothing for Will other than the high school girl memories of having a high school crush. I just wasn't thinking and made a mistake. Please don't end our marriage because I made a stupid error in judgment. Please don't do this, okay? The second option is that we come to an understanding of what our problems and expectations are. If necessary, when we return home, we can go to a psychologist. Looking back, I see that this episode was partly my fault. I should have been more in tune with your needs. But you also need to understand that you really hurt me, and frankly, I don't trust you as much as I did 2 days ago. It will take some time to rebuild this trust, and it may never return to the level it was. I vote for the second option, she said gloomily. If my vote is counted. This is not a voting issue. It's entirely your decision, and what I want doesn't really matter. What matters is what you want. My only position on this issue is that you cannot have both at the same time. I will not allow that. One more thing I should say before you decide what to do. If you decide that you want to stay in the marriage, you must understand that in the future, if something like this ever happens again, there will be no discussions, no second chances, no reconciliations. We will be done. Is this completely clear? Yes, absolutely. Outwardly, I was calm like the eye of a storm, but inside, I was seething as if the storm was here and roaring with all its might. She had already indicated her choice, but I gave my wife an ultimatum, and she has responded poorly to ultimatums in the past. Honestly, I would have been destroyed if she decided she wanted to go her own way after all, but I left no room for negotiation. Well, Lynn, so what will happen? Lord Jim, is it really necessary to ask? Of course, I want to stay married. I love, and always have loved, you. Like I said, I let a bunch of little crap get to me, and I had an error in judgment and made a mistake. Mistakes come at a price, and I accept that. I will have to pay the price, so be it. After which, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, giving me a reassuring smile. Her smile ended the storm that had been raging inside me for the past few days, and the sun illuminated my soul. I still wasn't happy with what happened, and even worse, I felt what could have happened if I wasn't here to stop everything. But I could deal with it. Besides, logically, I either accepted what she was saying or I didn't. I could keep trying to make her feel bad, mentally beating her up, and in turn being miserable myself, or I could accept what she told me and what the told me in the parking lot. What did I have to lose? God, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically, and what I really wanted to do was snuggle up with my lover and best friend away from work, home, kids, and freeways for a while and heal. To tell the truth, I almost understood her point of view. I felt someone tap me on the shoulder. It was Mike. It's really time for me to close up, and it's time for you guys to go home. I looked at Lynn, and a mysterious smile appeared on her face, and she blushed slightly. I feel a bit of a draft here, if you know what I mean. I think we should find some place to warm up and see if I can't attract you to me yet. Needing no further invitation, I stood up and smiled at Mike, then took my wife's hand and helped her out of the booth. I have one more request for you, Mike, and I think you should do it for free, I said jokingly. He frowned as if his stomach was bloated with gas. Okay, one more, if it doesn't take extra time. Do you have a bottle of champagne and tell me where the nearest motel with big beds and a jacuzzi is? I guess I'll go hunt for the prize. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one. What do you think of our story today? I think the story is gripping with emotional scenes and a poignant plot. In this story, I was completely on my husband's side. The alumni meeting was not worth it. What is your opinion? Write in the comments. Until new videos.